Hello, saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the
it.
writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing isn't
so some
there,
readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello, and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On this episode, I am joined by a journalist and now author whose debut, Tell Me How This Ends, came out in May this year. It's Jo Leevers. Hi, Jo. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming on. Let's start with the novel. Tell Me How This Ends. Tell us what it's all about.
So Tell Me How This Ends follows the story of Henrietta, who gets a new job transcribing people's life stories. And she does this from a cafe in a cancer drop-in centre. Now, Henrietta vows to do this job without getting emotionally involved because she's very punctilious and she's not really a people person. But all that changes when she meets her first client, who's called Annie. And Annie is in her 60s and is coming to the end of her life. But as Annie starts to tell her life story, it soon becomes clear that there was an unsolved crime in her past when Annie's sister Kath went missing, presumed drowned, when she was 18. And that changed the course of Annie's life. And when Henrietta hears this, she cannot help following up the strands of that story and beginning her own amateur investigation. But as she does so, it soon becomes clear that Henrietta is delving into her own past as well as Annie's life story. And that's when the two women develop quite an unusual friendship and discover the mystery that is at the heart of Annie's life story.
It sounds brilliant. And it's funny how I recently spoke to an author who actually, I think, blurbed your book is Mickey Brammer.
Yes, Mickey. Yeah, fantastic book. Yeah.
And it's funny how these kind of cross-generational relationships are like so interesting and so rich and like kind of coming to the fore now. What was it about? It's such an unusual setting that you put your protagonist in. You have them in this sort of drop-in center transcribing people's life stories. How did you reach that point? What drew you into like that specific thing?
Well, the idea came to me when I was actually visiting my mum in hospital, and she was only there for a few weeks, and it was a cancer hospital. So it was, you visit someone in hospital, you can't be there the whole time. So you spend a lot of time in the cafe. And that was where I'd be sitting, drinking endless cups of coffee and eating kind of old-fashioned sugary cakes. And I'd look around and just see all these people around me. And some were kind of day visitors who were maybe coming in for treatment. Other people were families. Other people were patients. And I'd look at all these people and think, everyone here has got these stories that, may never see the light of day, that they might not get to tell. And all these lives are kind of, it just put it into like stark relief that all these lives are going on around you and how little we really know about people. We might discount them. We might look at somebody like Henrietta and think, well, she looks kind of dull and she doesn't have very good fashion sense, so she's got nothing to tell. Or you might look at Annie, who's kind of, an older person, and think, well, they've lived their life, they've got nothing more to offer, or you just don't know. So it was that really kind of fascinated me.
Yeah, it's always good to remember that everyone has their own life and their own chaos going on. When, even if you just see them, they're sitting there reading a magazine, but it's like
in one particular role. Yeah,
exactly. You only get one dimension of a sort of multifaceted image when you see.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, it's also got a cold case, which is always going to be an exciting and fun kind of like dive back into the history, criminal investigation, amateur detective stuff. Always a riot.
Always good fun, yeah. And I wanted to set it in the 70s because I think there's a lot about that era that is kind of misunderstood, and I think a lot of things have come to the fore since, like, you know, Jimmy Savile and all those kind of rather more grimy stories coming to the fore. But I think for a long time it was kind of idealized as this kind of glamorous era where, you know, people had amazing clothes and so there were great festivals and parties, and I wanted to kind of cut through that and also say actually there was a darker side, and it was quite a grim time for women, particularly women who were working class and didn't have the access to women's liberation. It kind of passed them by. And attitudes to from the police. I also wanted to delve into that. So yeah, that's why I set it in the 70s. But there is also great music. So there's a great kind of soundtrack going on in the background to the story.
Yeah, that's true. That's almost true of like the 60s, 70s and 80s. There's a kind of like glamorization of them that people do talk about some of the other things, but it's generally people remember like the amazing music and the amazing parties and the amazing outfits
fashion.
and things.
Yeah,
Exactly. And I can see a bit of you, as I mentioned before, are a journalist. You can see a bit of the investigative nature coming in there. You wanting to like look into things that were somewhat buried, I guess, at the time, but involved with journalism. So obviously, you do spend a lot of time writing, but writing novels and fiction, is that something that you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, like a lot of us, I think, it was kind of like a lifelong ambition, but I didn't really have the confidence or the wherewithal to do it. So I think in my 20s, I kind of dabbled a bit and wrote short stories, but it wasn't ever my voice. I kind of felt like I was trying to imitate somebody else's voice. So yeah, without success, obviously, and quite rightly so. And then it was losing my mum, and then sadly losing a friend of mine who was my age, 4 years after that made me realize, like, that kind of truism that life is short, and if you don't take those chances and have a go, then you never know if you can do something. So that's what gave me the impetus really to have a go, and I really enjoyed it. So I thought, actually, even if I don't get published, I'm enjoying doing this. It's doing something different, writing in a different way. So that's what kept me going, really.
Yeah, I think it's, for me at least, and I've spoken to a few other people who agree, where it's like just writing is just a fun and sort of cathartic experience. I would do it anyway, I think, just for like my own like sanity and mental health. It just makes me feel better. So had you written anything before Tell Me How This Ends, or only when you were sort of in your early 20s, you said?
Yeah. No, I hadn't written anything before. So this was definitely the first novel. Yeah, but it went through a lot of edits.
Yeah. I mean, what people always say, like, novels are written in the edits.
Exactly.
That's
for
kind
sure.
of the truth of it for most stories, anyway. Where do you feel like you said that one of the things you were worried about why you kind of didn't write something earlier is finding a voice that was actually yours? Do you feel like you found that voice with this book? Yeah,
and I think that was just from seeing what I enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's when it feels like it's flowing and you're enjoying it. That's I reckon when it's your voice, when you're not kind of straining for effect or thinking, like, you think about the reader, you have to think about the reader. But yeah, when you're enjoying it and it feels natural and you kind of almost not thinking of what happens next, it just comes. That sounds a little pretentious, but I think you know what I mean.
When you're like lost in that moment, you're absorbed in the world, and like you're not thinking about anything else. You're just thinking about, this fun thing is happening. This character's saying this character's thinking this.
Yes, what could they think next? Yeah, particularly because my book might sound a little bit depressing to people that haven't read it, but there is humor in there, and there are funny bits. So that's nice to include as well. You kind of, that adds to the enjoyment of writing it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And this is your debut novel, but am I right in thinking that you actually published 2 books this year?
Yes. And that was by accident rather than design. So it seems a bit greedy, but they were both out in the same month.
Yeah.
Because I started working on an interiors book called Victorian Modern with a photographer who I work with a lot called Rachel Smith. And because publishing, takes a long time for ideas to come to fruition, and then there was COVID, that ended up being delayed a little bit. So that's why that and the novel came out actually in the same month and the same year.
Yes, exactly. And Victorian Modern is the book, and it's non-fiction. Is that very much an extension of the sort of things you write about as a journalist?
Yeah, exactly. So Rachel and I thought we'd love to create a book together, and we kind of took a step back and looked at all the types of stories that we'd done for different interiors magazines. And I thought, which are the ones that have I enjoyed writing the most and interviewing people about? And it was homes that were period homes that had their own character, but where the owners had added like their own layer almost to the story, and added their own personality and made it feel more modern, but still retained the original architecture. So that was my pitch, but a bit more concise than that.
A bit more refined.
Yeah.
So, I mean, speaking of pitches and things like that.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
You, in the same month, amusingly, but you have a fiction novel out and you have a non-fiction book. Did you find those two processes very different?
Yes, really different, because the interiors book, again, it took a while actually to work out the structure for the book, but once it was nailed down, that was it. You have like a chapter introducing how each room was used by the Victorians, and then kind of examples of how contemporary owners have used those rooms. Mm-hmm. So once that was nailed down, it was a lot more. The book had its shape, whereas a novel, yes, there are kind of structural devices. But it's a lot. It felt like a more unwieldy thing to be. It's like wrestling an octopus, or trying to get to grips with it. That was a lot harder, I think, for me.
So the non-fiction one is more like everything is sort of so planned out that when it actually comes to creating it, you're like, oh, okay, so I just put this piece here, this piece is going there. You're going to do some photos for this bit, and then it's all kind of like. It seems like an oversimplification to say paint by numbers, but it's along those lines. It was,
once we had the structure for one chapter, then we just followed through. And, there were a lot of decisions to make along the way, because you want to have a spread of different types of houses, and houses that use colour and ones that are more neutral, and all those kind of considerations. And the book does have a pace. So that was quite new for me as well, because I'd only written features before. But with a book, you kind of need to think of how the reader progresses through, what's going to keep them flicking. So I guess in that way it is similar to fiction, but a different kind of structure, a different beast.
Yes, indeed. And I'm wondering, your agent is the wonderful Hayley Steed, who I've spoken to on the podcast before.
Ah, brilliant.
Did you sign, was that through just like an open submissions thing?
Yes. So I first started thinking about agents after I entered the Bath Novel Award, which I would recommend to everybody, that or other competitions, just because it gives you a really good focus. So I got longlisted for that. I didn't get shortlisted, but I wasn't surprised because the book wasn't really finished. So from that, I had interest from one agent, but the book was really rough and ready. So that didn't go any further. But it made me think, maybe there is something here. Maybe somebody would like to see this book. So then I started researching agents, and Hayley was always kind of on my my hit list.
Yeah.
So when I had a slightly better draft ready to go, I sent it to her and a couple of other agents. She came straight back to me. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was a really good start.
When you've like researched agents and you know the one you want, and then they're the one that gets back to you, that's such a dream come true.
Yeah. And to be honest, I found the whole process quite stressful.
It is, yeah.
So I thought, actually, this is the agent I want and the agency I want. So why am I kind of tying myself in knots, like waiting for other people to come back to me? So
yeah.
I withdrew from the other agents, and I haven't regretted that decision.
Amazing. When you pitched that, did you pitch the fiction and the non-fiction? Does Hayley work on your non-fiction stuff as well?
No, it was just the fiction.
Okay.
The non-fiction, I just went straight to Thames and Hudson.
Oh, okay.
And I think that is more, I mean, it's not the only way to do it, and but I think it is more kind of acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Hayley was just the fiction.
Yeah, I think obviously there's a huge range of non-fiction, like different things you can do within non-fiction. But I think, especially since you come from a background, the journalism background of interior design and that kind of stuff, it seems like a pretty obvious validation, I guess, when the publisher says, oh, yeah, it would make sense for you to make a book about modern Victorian interiors.
So for that one, I just pitched into, submissions at Thames and Hudson or something like that. And
okay.
And it worked.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Does Hayley do non-fiction as well? Or is she just...
I think she does, yeah.
Okay.
We'll see what happens further down the line, maybe.
yeah, we'll see. Because tell me how this ends. This is book 1 of a 2-book deal with Lake Union.
Uh-huh.
And I know because you mentioned it before we started recording, but you're already well underway with book number 2, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I assume you can't really say anything about it at the moment.
I don't know what I can say. I don't think it's top secret. I'm working on book 2. And Tell Me How This Ends was about grief and the end of life.
Mm-hmm.
Book 2 is about the beginnings of life and motherhood.
Oh, lovely.
But there's also a mystery. So that's
okay.
Similar as to book 1. There's a mystery at the core of the book, and that takes the characters on a bit of a journey.
Is it a cold case?
It's not really a cold case.
Okay.
It's a mother who is estranged from her children, and why that happened.
Okay. So a second fiction book on the way. Are you thinking about doing, and I know we sort of talked about it a little bit just a second ago, but are you thinking about doing another non-fiction, some more interior stuff?
Yeah, me and Rachel Smith we'd both like to do that. So that's definitely a discussion that we want to have, because the first book is Victorian Modern. Uh-huh. So the idea from the beginning, my idea was always to have a series of different architectural styles and people who've interpreted them in interesting ways. So yeah, we'll see. That'd be great if it happens.
Oh, and then you could like build up a series of like kind of your investigation. Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
that'd be really
but
cool.
Nothing's ever guaranteed in publishing, is it? So
no, of course not. Just before we move into the final question of the episode, when it comes to doing non-fiction submissions, because I have a lot more fiction authors on here than I do non-fiction. The process of submitting is quite different. Is it sort of, do you have to have a lot more ready to go for a non-fiction submission?
Yeah, I think that probably helps a lot. I mean, we had examples of photo shoots that we'd done, so I sent those through. So it immediately gave the publishers this is roughly how a spread could look. We'd almost mocked up spreads.
Yeah.
And I had a synopsis, and I'd also listed other books that were kind of in the market. I think that's a really useful thing to do.
Yeah.
So these are the books that are out there. This is how my book would be different. Yeah, so there was a shape to it.
Yeah, which I think that's the best way of saying it, is like there's it sounds like with the nonfiction one, in your experience, you kind of pitch it as this sort of like, this is how the product is going to look. Obviously it's not all filled in at that point, but you're like, this is kind of how it's going to look. And then presumably there's a little back and forth with the publisher, but it's very much set in its ways, versus when you submit a fiction novel to an agent or a publisher, and you kind of, even though you've written the whole thing, you know that that's going to change sometimes quite dramatically.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, editing, I think, is a crucial part in not non-fiction and fiction.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think my fiction book was definitely helped a lot more by people that knew a lot more about what they were doing than I did.
Well, editors do know what they're doing. In my experience,
they're
editors are
geniuses. The things that they come up with, or the questions that they ask, just things that you haven't considered.
Yeah, exactly.
And then all the legalities as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
all the
that you might
stuff.
not have thought of.
Exactly. So we are heading into the end of the episode, which means we are at the final question, which, as always, is, Joe, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book would it be?
Now, this book I picked up again the other day to reread, and I thought, yes, I could reread this. So it is I Am by Maggie O'Farrell, which is her recounting several brushes with death. But each chapter is just a brilliant standalone chapter. And I reckoned all of them stand up to rereading. And if I was on a desert island, then maybe I would have had a few brushes with death to have survived and washed up there. So I thought that would be quite inspiring reading.
That's a really cool. I've not read that book, but I've heard about it.
It's great, really good.
Maggie O'Farrell is always great.
Yeah.
That's a really cool choice, and I think unique. No one's ever said that before. So
great.
Yeah, great choice. Well, thank you so much, Joe.
Oh, no, thank you. It's a great chat.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks for telling us all about your writing and your 2 books that came out in 1 month. It's been awesome chatting with you and hearing all about it.
Thanks, Jamie. It was really good to chat to you.
And for anyone listening, if you want to keep up with what Jo is doing, you can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Jo Leevers. That's JOLEEVERS. And to make sure you don't miss an episode of this podcast, follow along on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. You can support the show on Patreon, and for more bookish chat, check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Jo, and thanks to everyone listening. We'll catch you in the next episode.